This is Patrick Dolance with the third and final presentation focusing on market activity. In this presentation, we'll begin by introducing the concept of supply, examine the ways that it's similar and distinct from the notion of demand, and then combine supply and demand together in our first exploration of equilibrium for a particular market. Let's start with our definition of supply. When economists speak of supply, we're speaking of a concept that is parallel to demand but focuses on producers or sellers of a good or service. So in that context, we're interested in prices and quantities. We're interested in the ability and willingness. We're focused on a particular time period, and we want to hold all other relevant factors constant or frozen. Notice this definition is extremely close to the one that we used for demand. Unlike our approach that focused on demand, when we look at supply and uncover a generic law of supply, we discover that the quantity of a good supplied in a given time period increases as the price increases, all other things being equal. While demand suggested a negative or downward sloping line, supply suggests a positive or upward sloping line. The law of supply gives us a generic graph that looks like this. Just as we did with demand, in our focus on supply, we also want to look at the determinants. The 5 determinants of supply are the ceteris paribus factors that matter the most. The first of these determinants refers to changes in technology. As technology makes it easier to produce a product, that impacts the costs of production, and that impacts the ability and willingness to sell at various prices. The second determinant refers to changes in the prices of resources. Just as technology can impact the cost of production, so too are the costs of raw materials, or the costs of labor, or other resources. The third determinant of supply refers to changes in the prices of related goods. Here we're particularly interested in the opportunity cost of a particular production decision. So, for instance, if General Motors is producing sport utility vehicles and they suddenly notice that there's a new enthusiasm for hybrid automobiles, the decision to continue producing SUVs involves sacrificing the opportunity to get more extensively involved in the production of hybrids. As hybrids become increasingly attractive, GM will rethink its ability and willingness to produce SUVs. The fourth determinant of supply refers to changes in producer expectations. As before, expectations refer to our best guess of the future. When businesses anticipate changes in the future, they begin to incorporate those anticipated changes into their behavior today, and that's what this determinant is about. Finally, the size of the market matters, and so the supply curve, particularly with regard to the units or the magnitude of the units on the axes, the size of the market will affect the supply curve. Just as before, when we were looking at demand, we can also, in the case of supply, focus on the difference between movement along the supply curve versus shift in supply. Notice how very similar this discussion is to the one we did in the last presentation. When we look at movement along a supply curve, the first thing to note is that we're talking about a price change. Economists would refer to this as a change in the quantity supplied. Because we're assuming that the price changed and that the original supply curve is still valid, our ceteris paribus assumption must be valid, must be accurate, and must be holding in place. And finally, just as with demand, when we talk about movement along the supply curve, we're suggesting that the change that occurred is endogenous, or internal, or explained within the model. A particular supply curve provides the price-quantity relationship holding all other things constant. If a price changes, that particular specific supply curve remains valid and helps us to understand how the change in quantity supplied will respond. As we move our attention to the notion of a shift in the supply curve, you'll notice that the parallels continue. Here, our attention has to be centered around a change in one of the determinants of supply. Economists would refer to a shift in a supply curve as, quote, a change in supply, unquote. Just as before, if we're witnessing a shift in the curve, then we can be confident that ceteris paribus is no longer valid. Our ceteris paribus assumption, as you recall, is the idea that the determinants of supply have not changed, but in this case, obviously one of them has. Finally, in a parallel fashion to demand, if something outside the price-quantity relationship has changed, something outside the parameters of what the supply curve is attempting to capture, then we would identify this as an exogenous or external change. And of course, the graph, much like the case of demand, suggests that a brand new supply curve would be more appropriate if one of the determinants was the key factor that changed. Our final task in this presentation is to put the pieces together. When we combine supply and demand on the same graph, which is something you almost certainly anticipated given that the vertical axis in both cases was price and the horizontal axis in both cases was quantity, when we combine them together, the two very distinct generalizations that the law of demand and the law of supply provided for us suggest we have a downward sloping line, the blue demand curve in this graph, and an upward sloping line, the red supply curve in this graph. When we start to think about particular situations, this graph helps us tease out the implications of supply and demand. For instance, imagine an initial price that is far above the intersection of the red and the blue line. At a very high price, our model predicts a relatively low level of quantity demanded, but a relatively high quantity supplied. If we observe lots of items being provided by sellers, but relatively few being demanded by consumers, then we would recognize that we have a situation of accumulating inventories or a surplus. As firms are confronted with surplus merchandise, eventually they realize they need to lower their price. Therefore, any surplus situation, that is to say, a discrepancy caused by a price higher than the intersection between supply and demand, will have a downward tendency on prices. In a similar fashion, if the price starts out below the intersection of the red line and the blue line, then we have the opposite situation. We have relatively high quantities demanded, but relatively low quantities supplied. That situation would manifest itself in the appearance of a shortage. If there's a shortage of goods available at a given price, firms have a strong incentive to raise prices. Therefore, any price below the intersection has a natural tendency to go up. As you can see, we have here now an economic version of equilibrium. Any price above the intersection is not likely to be stable or permanent because there's a tendency for it to fall. Any price below the intersection of the red and the blue lines is also not stable because there's a tendency for it to rise. As surpluses push prices down and shortages push prices up, we find ourselves eventually at the intersection where the quantity supplied matches the quantity demanded at P star. P star then becomes the equilibrium price, and Q star becomes the equilibrium quantity. Notice in this story that all of that movement was achieved not through any conscious effort of some central organizing entity, but through the self-interested decisions of individual consumers and producers. This self-adjusting quality is very important because it suggests that the movement to equilibrium happens as if guided by, you guessed it, as if guided by an invisible hand. This concludes our initial examination of supply and demand. You'll see this graph again. We use it throughout the course in various contexts.